Okay, welcome everybody. Nice big audience today to hear Lore
Ruben.
Lore Ruben. And this is the one of the final chapters of her fascinating and a lot of other adjectives, autobiography. There are going to be, if you haven't got a copy of this, you really should get one and read it, because the opportunity today is to buy a copy for $20 with a personal autograph from the author.
What's it called?
And it's called Memories of a Chaotic World. What Lore is going to do today is give us an excerpt from one of the final chapters of the book, and then we'll have a chance for some questions afterwards. And I think you're ready. You have your glasses, you have your light. And we can hear her. And yes, never fear. I'm okay. I'm going to sit down and be quiet and start working the slides, and we'll hear Lore tell her story. Okay, Lore, go ahead.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Actually, there are two things here. The final chapter is my father's tragic end, and I'm going to read some excerpts of my reaction to his end, but also I'm going to read what the end is about, which has to do with the Food and Drug Administration, which I'm going to call the FDA. So you all know that's the Food and Drug Administration. And I also want to say that for those of us here who have not read the book, don't think I'm being an absolute bitch to my father. He had repeatedly, with great rage, kicked me out of his life, and I had it, and I was sort of finished with trying to make a relationship. So that's why my behavior is the way it is. All right. I had not spoken to my father since my last contact with Ilse, when she told me that my father did not wish to see me. It is odd that my memory, which seems so sharp and precise about my past, gets extremely vague in relationship to my father. At some point, my sister Eva must have effected another reconciliation, because I have an image of a scene involving my brother when he was a toddler or 2 years old, after I had returned from Oberlin. My amusement points to the cynicism with which I viewed my father by this time. He had ejected me one too many times. The last reconciliation was totally false. He avoided sharing any of his ideas or work with me. In the past, he had burdened me with trying to interest me in his research, which was very much beyond my comprehension, as if I was an intellectual equal. Now we talked in the most artificial manner. He decided I was going to be a writer because I had written some short stories in Oberlin. It was assumed that I would be famous, but otherwise we had no topic in common. At the same time, I believe, he was becoming renowned in some places and had quite a following. He was developing his orgone accumulator, which at other times I'm going to call the orgone box because it goes by both names. He was developing his orgone accumulator and was being taken up by avant-garde circles as a great therapist, and had many students wishing to learn his techniques. This spreading fame eventually led to his undoing. However, while gathering fame with many admirers, he became even more renowned as the creator of the orgone box. When mentioning my father to me, many people suppressed a snicker, talking about the box. Woody Allen, in the movie Sleeper, called it an orgasmatron and put it in his movie. We danced around each other with extreme care, not voicing any true emotions. It should be remembered that my father had no tolerance for hidden, veiled feelings and unvoiced emotions. He was being completely unnatural to his true self. He tolerated my evasiveness for quite a while. Eventually, he accused me of accepting money, the very occasional $20 bill, without showing that I cared for him at all. I don't think I answered this and probably just saw him less often. He started to make critical comments. At some point, he told me that he could not stand people with small eyes. He liked an open look. I did not understand at this time that he meant that I was armored and not open with him. I was very insulted by this, as my small eyes were due to edema my face, which was plaguing me, though I had no concept why it was happening to me. I introduced him to Julie, my future husband, called Julius Rubin, nicknamed Julie in his Jewish Brooklyn neighborhood. Julie was never known as a girl's name. I found my father able to accept our relationship without any of the worries about our future as expressed by my mother. But his conversations with Julie were as stilted and careful as the ones with me. It had already been described how tenuous and superficial our relationship was becoming. Julie could not stand him. He found his social theories about work democracy childish and naive, and he could sense the underlying tendency to pressure people into becoming his disciples. When we were married, my father gave us a set of 5 books he had written, which were now translated into English and recently released. No one in my family believed in ceremony or celebration, but giving us his books seemed to me a sign of true self-involvement, a lack of thinking of what we needed in our new life and only thinking of how important he was. Eventually, we just, quote, dropped out of his life. There was no quarrel or disagreement. We just stopped calling. My father was not one to pursue us or invite us, so we just drifted apart. A note about these books. They were written in the early 1930s and became great classics, especially character analysis and mass psychology of fascism, which are still being sold. Maybe all the books are being sold, but in large number, and have been reproduced in their original form very recently. In 1933, they were publicly burned by the Nazis, together with Freud and Erich Fromm and one other analyst, and my father was the only Berlin practicing analyst at the time to have his books burned. When the books were translated into English by Theodore Wolff and published in 1948 and 1949, orgone energy was added where it fit into the text. These later revisions played an important part in my father's fate because the Food and Drug Administration, when they got involved, decided they were all ads for his orgone box. There were associates of my mother who pressured me to renew my contact, which I angrily rejected, but somehow seemed to have heard. For one day, while passing by my father's house in my car, and I know this was in the summer of 1950, I decided to drop in unannounced just to say hello. Ilse was in the kitchen and greeted me with worried restraint. We were chatting politely when my father suddenly entered the kitchen to ask Ilse something. He looked right through me as if I were not there, talked to Ilse and left. At first I thought, is it possible he did not recognize me? But I knew this was not correct. To pretend nothing had happened and to suppress any feelings was my first urge. Therefore I asked Ilse, as if to suggest she was not a good hostess, for a cup of coffee. This she reluctantly made. Then she started to explain that my father had some kind of dental procedure and was in pain, as if to imply that he truly did not notice me. We left it at that, and I left as quickly as I could without showing any outward affect. I knew that there was going to be no further relationship. This was the end. Truly, I never did speak to him again, and as before, I pushed the experience away into the subterranean recesses of my mind. Totally separated from my father, I became closer and closer to Mother's orbit. I was still feeling fairly alienated from her, but she was skilled in offering us more and more perks, which we could not afford, and we were compliant with these bribes. At the same time, I was following her path into medicine, then psychiatry, and then psychoanalysis, which, in spite of me, I was enjoying very much. So while I was entangled with my mother, my sister entered my father's life with stern determination. She left her husband at Reich's request and joined him in Rangeley, Maine, becoming his assistant. A few weeks later, she sent a letter to Mother, dictated by my father, which stated categorically that she did not wish to have any further contact with her. Her contacts with me were confined to the few times she was separated from my father. But at no time did she ever discuss her work, her life, or events affecting my father's life. In the last 4 years of my father's life, my sister and I had no contact at all. She dropped out and disappeared together with him. One day I was pursuing the New York Times when on a back page I came upon an article of about 2.5 inches with a headline saying something like, "Scientist sent to prison." With total surprise, I read the prisoner's name. It was Wilhelm Reich. The article gave no details of what had happened or what he had been arrested for. A wave of shock flowed through me, and then shame. My father was a prisoner. How could I possibly face the world? What would my fellow residents think of me? This emotion was intense, but I don't remember feeling any worry about him or his welfare. Given the difficulties getting there without a car, I was puzzled and surprised when my husband appeared one day at the hospital. He explained that my sister had called and said that my father had died in prison, and if I wanted, I could come to the funeral, and then hung up without further information. Julie did not know what to do. He thought it better to come and tell me. Excuse me, pages are sticking together. My initial reaction was to feel very strange and not in touch with myself, and very grateful to Julie for taking the trouble to come and get me. Then I got into a dither about whether I should attend the funeral. I pondered this for a few days, unable to make up my mind. I had no idea when or where the funeral would take place, and also no address or phone number for my sister. It was an odd predicament and led to a lot of work to gather relevant information. I decided to call the warden of the penitentiary where my father had been imprisoned. I wanted to know whether he had committed suicide or how he had died. The warden was stiff and formal, did not express any sympathy, but did inform me that my father had not committed suicide, but died of a heart failure in his sleep. Of course, since he did not notify, my father did not notify anyone that he was having chest pain or other symptoms, he may have willfully contributed to his death. It happened shortly after a parole hearing where my father was denied parole. The warden also honored my request to tell me what funeral company was handling the body. Years later, I received a gift of the copy of the prison record obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, where I found out that the warden did not know any daughter called Lore, as she was not in the permitted list of visitors and correspondence. Under this constraint, he certainly was polite and helpful. I was now able to obtain the information that the funeral would be held in Organon, in Maine, and what date. Furthermore, the funeral company told me the name of the motel in Rangeley and the room number where my sister was staying. After further indecisiveness, I decided it would be better to attend the funeral, even if I later regretted it, than not attend and regret something that cannot be undone. We arrived in Portland, this is Portland, Maine, on a dark November afternoon, rented a car to drive to Rangeley at the northern edge of Maine. We chose the straightest route, which, however, covered the back roads. Never had I witnessed such a bleak landscape, bare trees with thin branches, brown plowed fields, empty of any crops, rare houses without lights in the window. No other cars on the road, no people. It looked like a nightmare winter desert. I had only visited Maine in the summer, and then only the much more populated coastal areas. This landscape was depressing, even frightening. It was a very lengthy road trip, and we only arrived around 11 o'clock that night. We found our motel and knocked on the door of my sister's room. But it was William Steig, the cartoonist and disciple of my father, whom we roused out of bed. We had been given the wrong room number. His book of cartoons had come out fairly recently and had made a big splash in the book world. I found the cartoons offensive and condescending. The most unpleasant one was a miserable young man saying, "My mother loved me, but she died." This was supposed to be funny, but I thought it showed contempt for somebody's suffering. Steig met us in the parking lot. I asked where my sister was. He said my sister was sitting vigil up at the observatory at Organon, but as an outsider, I was forbidden to go there. I said, "But I'm family." Steig answered in a low, growling voice, "You should have thought of that before." I was incensed. I said, or rather shouted, "How dare you? You have no idea about it." My husband became nervous and made me hush up. And to this day I feel deprived of giving this judgmental man a piece of my mind. The next day we met up with my sister, who surprisingly also greeted me with warmth and great relief. I only realized later that she was alone there, isolated from the disciples, bereft of her second husband, who had been a close disciple to Reich, who either had to remain at home to take care of their livestock or was avoiding the disciples because he had become person non grata to Reich, over some minor misunderstanding. Nor was Eva that close to Ilse. The funeral was held on a hillside at Organon. A grave had been dug, and above it was a large bust of my father's head. There were at least 50 people there. My greatest wound of that day came when a group of disciples who had chartered an airplane from New York arrived. They included at least 3 fellow psychiatric residents from my own hospital. What a mockery. They had never mentioned my father to me or told me about their hidden beliefs. But of course they knew exactly who I was. They did not acknowledge me at the funeral, not even with a nod. I wondered why they did not invite me onto their flight, when instead we had a large and long, tortuous journey. But then I also observed that none of the disciples greeted or acknowledged my sister, or Ilse and Peter. It was clear that my family were the outsiders at this funeral. One of the older disciples gave a graveside eulogy. The words that stick in my mind are, "Not in 1,000, nay, 2,000 years And then something like, has someone like Reich arisen? They were comparing him to the second coming of the Messiah. I was visiting the funeral of a cult leader. At lunch, Eva and Julie and I ate in a restaurant where there were several disciples eating. Eva told me that we have nothing to do with them. She gave no details about the situation. That we were at peace and friendly with each other. It was obvious that she was very happy I came. Then suddenly, she started to tickle me aggressively. I had a very hard time to make her stop. She was showing her other side, her ambivalence towards me, but also her lack of self-control. It was a warning to me that the old sister was still buried in the new one. I say it was about 30 years later, but it was probably sooner that I began receiving documents from Reichians and organizations like the ACLU.
Would you like a sip of water?
Yes, I could use a sip of water. I'm going to give it back to you. Gleaned from the Freedom of Information Act at what had happened with the FDA to lead my father's arrest and death in prison. There was an uproar in liberal circles of the violation of the freedom of speech, and very recently I obtained more personal information from biographies and letters by my father. I learned that the FDA for quite a few years had spent half its budget on investigating my father's orgone accumulator, and then generally overreacted. At the same time, my father made numerous mistakes in handling this situation. But after I wrote this, I decided the FDA never changed their mind at all. I'll get to that. In the late 1940s, while my father's name was rising amongst avant-garde people, there was also the large misbelieving crowd who snickered when his name was mentioned in the orgone box. This cynicism reached the ears of the FDA. There were articles written in well-known magazines. The FDA began investigating the device. Finding no proof of the existence of orgone energy, they decided he was a snake oil charlatan claiming he could cure cancer, and he was out for money. They decided to make a visit to Oregon and did not obey the signs forbidding access without permission, but drove right in. Here my father made his first mistake. He became enraged and said they were trespassing and that he would shoot them if they did not leave. What he should have done is invite them in and show them his lab and equipment and pictures of his lectures to students and his many mice that were part of his cancer experiments, so that he could show he was a true, serious researcher. It must be noted, however, that he did not follow the good practices like peer review articles, nor did he ever take exams to become a licensed physician in the United States. Chris Turner, in his book, points out that he was like a 19th century scientist. He took himself seriously, but he followed the rules, and it's only really about mid-century that philosophers of science began to dictate what a proper scientific project was. So Albert Einstein, was also a 19th century scientist, as was Darwin, of course. All right, so my father threatened to shoot the agents. The agents retreated and left one of theirs in Rangeley to continue the investigation. This man met secretly with one of Reich's local employees, whom he later married, and heard about the opinion of the locals living in Rangeley, that Reich was running pornography and getting women involved in sex trafficking. The FDA added this rumor to their investigation. When their budget was expanded to half of what was allotted, the research continued. They interviewed almost all the orgone box users and heard only good accounts of the experience. They believed that Reich was promoting his accumulator for cancer cure. Columbia Presbyterian Hospital sent one hopeless dying patient for experiment, and that patient died. There may have been 2 others who also died. They consulted all kinds of physicists, and all, that is the FDA, consulted all kinds of physicists. All agreed that there was no orgone energy reaching us from outer nature or the atmosphere. The FDA decided to bring a request for an injunction against the accumulator to trial. Here, Reich made a second fatal mistake. The lawyer who had served as a counsel for Reich's foundation, that is, would handle all his business was through a foundation. The lawyer was promoted to chief prosecutor for the state of Maine and became the prosecutor of the trial. My father objected to the court about this appointment. The court ruled that the prosecutor had not been a personal lawyer and kept him as the prosecutor.
Pause for a sip of water while all this noise.
I don't know. My father objected to the court about this appointment. The court ruled, I did that already. As Reich's attorney, this lawyer certainly knew that there was no sex trafficking or pornography going on. Reich became mistrustful of all lawyers and decided to represent himself. His followers tried desperately to fund and hire lawyers, but Reich forbade it. So at this court hearing, Reich took charge and proclaimed that a court of law is not able to judge science. This, of course, fell on deaf ears, and an injunction was ordered against shipping accumulators across state line. The court also ordered the destruction of all his publications, books and journals, claiming that all his writings were advertisements for the accumulator. It is at this point that the ACLU asked to be admitted to the trial. He refused them, and they wanted to become a friend of the court or whatever it's called, but he did not want this. He did not trust lawyers. The ACLU felt there was a serious First Amendment breach here. But the books and journals from libraries, stores, publishers were taken for disposal to the incinerators in New York City. This was the second burning of his books. His first was by the Nazis. And the FDA forced Reich to burn all accumulators in his possession. Reich became more and more angry, threatening the United States government with using his cloudbuster to make floods in May. This is before climate change was. And then ran away to the desert in the west to make rain there. But in the meantime, a colleague of his, a Dr. Silver, sent an orgone box across state lines. There followed an arrest of Reich and a trial for contempt of court. Again, Reich refused all legal help and refused to attend his court hearing. This was Reich's third and most serious mistake. In his absence, the court ruled that he was not to publish any journals or articles or books detailing any of his research on any subject, and then sentenced him to 2 years of prison rather than the usual 1 year. And they also imposed a financial fine. The last straw was that a sympathetic judge offered to have a psychiatric exam so that he could plead guilty to insanity as a defense, which would have also destroyed all this work. And that's
Thank you.
Wow.
Now you can have some coffee or.
I think the coffee's cool enough now. Yes.
Thought you would enjoy this picture, which I found on the internet. No explanation, no caption. Sexual Revolution is one of the foundation classic books by Wilhelm Reich. Who has a question or a comment?
Everybody's dumbfounded then, okay?
We're all dumbfounded, yeah.
I'll ask a question.
Henry has a question. Okay, I have.
3 people here.
What exactly is an orgone?
Well, you're asking actually the wrong person, because I'm not quite sure. I know that he developed it, originally Freud had libido theory, and so it was an energy concept that had to do with the orgasm. But that changed over time. And what he thought the orgone was, I'm not quite sure, but it was some life energy, but it was also out in the atmosphere and in nature. It wasn't just in the body. That's all I can tell you. And it does, as far as scientists go, it doesn't exist. I don't know whether it exists or not. what I do know is when people go into the orgone box and they feel better, I don't think that's any different than if you go into a sweat thing for a kiva or whether you go into a sauna. I mean, I think that you feel better in this enclosed, very tightly sealed off environment with your own sweat.
And maybe because you think you will.
What?
And maybe because you think you will feel
Right,
better.
expectation.
Well, possibly, I don't know.
Gail.
Lori, thank you. That was absolutely wonderful. The clarity and the way you put everything together. My question relates to the role of philosophers of science in determining what is scientific or properly scientific. And in that connection, my understanding is that you and others who did a residency in psychiatry and then went on to train as a psychoanalyst is the typical path. But one of the young philosophers at the University of New Mexico, he trained as a psychoanalyst, but his background was his doctorate in philosophy. So my question is, are there non-doctor psychoanalysts who take a different path to become a professional in that occupation or that profession?
Oh, that's a very simple question. The Americans Medical Association or Psychoanalytic Association, whoever, when psychoanalysis arrived on these shores here, decided it had to be a medical profession. Otherwise it would not be taken seriously. So contrary to Europe, where you had lay analysts, in America you had to be a doctor. Then in 1980s sometime, there was a lawsuit brought by 3 psychologists, I think PhD psychologists, who said that the American Psychoanalytic Association was in constraint of trade. And this was a big and expensive lawsuit, and it ended with them winning. So since then, you can become a psychoanalyst without being a doctor. And in fact, I'm not sure that that's not taken over, now. But you could be a PhD psychologist, you could be a master's degree social worker, you could be a nurse practitioner. I mean, you had to have some background, but you could become a member of the American. Is that what you wanted to know?
I'm very curious. I guess I have the floor. I'm very curious about the current attitudes toward Freud, who made many breakthroughs way back, but there's been so much advanced information since then. And I just wonder how the psychoanalytic community views Freud and his contributions.
Well, he, of course, was a 19th century type of scientist. Freud, of course, he doesn't know anything about it. He died before this all came on. Freud is very lucky because there's been so much brain research in the meantime that has underlined a lot of his theories. I wouldn't say everything he ever talked about is scientific, but his whole book on dreams, his idea of secondary and primary process, his idea that there are memories that are not conscious. I cannot I mean, I can't list all the things that have now been found on PET scans to light up in the brain and certain things, things that nobody knew about when Freud was alive. Does that answer your
Yes,
question?
thank you.
Over here?
Laurie, did his disciples carry sorry, did his disciples carry forward his ideas after his death? Was there any organization?
Yeah, there've been a number of different, first of all, there are those disciples, especially in Europe and especially in Vienna, who are just enamored with his early work. And I don't know where they stand on orgone energy. Whereas in Berlin, his disciples are all into making the deserts bloom and orgone energy, and they do therapy that Reich started, but Reich did body therapy to get free association and to verbalize, I mean, another way to get into the unconscious instead of through psychoanalysis. And they do the body therapy without any verbal content. So they're really extreme. In America, there were all kinds of splits, but his therapies, for instance, were taken over by other people and changed a little, like Lowen does vegetotherapy, whatever. There are different groups in America, and the worst was the people who took over the museum, the Wilhelm Reich Museum in Rangeley on Organon, was run by a lady who published books that weren't supposed to be published for 50 years and was a very strong anti-family person. And now she's dead, and now the museum is doing very well with all kinds of conferences. So, yeah, there's really very many different groups in America.
Okay, is there someone? Okay.
What,
And then you.
what about the financial aspects of his life? Did he live comfortably and handle financially aspects sensibly?
Yes, as a matter of fact, he was a feminist. He believed that the man only contributes to the household what the woman does. So sometimes we lived in total poverty while he had a car and phonographs and all kinds of cameras. So he always lived comfortably. He also came from a comfortable background. And he accumulated a lot of money. Not that he died with a lot of money. A lot of it went to fines and things.
Okay, Paul is next, and then Jerry Paul is next, and then
I'm sorry, you're confusing me.
There's somebody before you.
Oh, Jim.
Then it's you.
Oh, okay.
But you have
no, he has a microphone, just wait until Paul's done, and then it's your turn.
Once he became under investigation, his actions are certainly strange and even counterproductive and directed almost to get him convicted. I think that needs some explanation, and I was wondering what you thought his purpose was in these while he was under investigation. He certainly knew that that the state would win, I would guess.
Well, none of us, I think, really expected the FDA to be totally stuck on everything they began with. So they were very rigid. But I didn't know him at the time, but my brother says, and other people, he had moved to Maine, maybe in 1950, and in 1952 he had he was experimenting with radioactive material, and he just ruined the whole place with radiation, and he had all kinds of theories about that, but everybody left, and then he was alone practically in Maine. I mean, all his disciples, had to leave, and he started to drink, apparently, heavily. I don't remember him as somebody who drank. I mean, I never saw him drink at all, but maybe he had wine or something with dinner sometimes, but he did not drink, and he became very alcoholic, so he was not rational at the time anymore when all this was going on.
So, Lori, you use the word disciple, which is a word we don't hear much of these days, and I was wondering what exactly you mean by it.
Well, I can't give you a scientific or a grammatical answer, but these were people who believed in him. They didn't question him, and they followed his orders. Long before all this happened, for instance, he had a woman working for him, and then she got married, and the husband was like my husband. He couldn't stand, my father. And he kicked the man out. He forbade all his colleagues, if you want to call them that, to treat him or talk to him. And when she wouldn't divorce her husband, then she was kicked out. And so, I mean, they were following orders. That's why we call them disciples instead of just...
Isn't that a strange form of behavior?
Well, of course it's a strange... We have to distinguish. This is a man who wrote some very brilliant books that are still quoted and reprinted and read, and early in his life, and then he became less desirable as a person, I guess, and being very strict with his followers was part of that. They had to be disciples.
Do any of the boxes still exist?
Do any of the boxes still exist? Well, you're asking the wrong person. I don't know. I do know that my niece has one, and I think my brother has one. I don't know that he uses it, but she might. Yeah. And there may be others. I just don't,
As you look back at Freud, he had a lot of disciples as well, but he had an exceedingly detailed theory of what was happening in the human. Now, as I look at Reich, and I know very little about him, but I'm not getting the essence of why he drew the disciples. He's got the box, he's got this mysterious something in the atmosphere, but is there some kind of a theory that underlines this? Maybe it's somewhere else in the book, but I'm not getting it.
Oh, well, it's probably in lots of other books too. He was a psychoanalyst, so first he had followers, a lot of followers, because he invented some new things for psychoanalysis in the line of character structure, which were really more informative than Anna Freud with her mechanisms of defense. I mean, they were more, so there was that. And then he developed, when he started getting in trouble with Freud, I don't know, I mean, anyway, they were beginning to have a breach. He started doing a body therapist. Now, this was a no-no. In psychoanalysis, you do not touch the body at all. I mean, that's a no-no. So he started a whole new way of treating people by, he had a theory of armoring at different levels of the body, and that the energy, now I can't remember, the chi of China goes, I think, from the floor up, and Reich's theory therefore was the same, except it went from the top down, I think. I may have it wrong, the Chinese may be from the top down. Anyway, he started this therapy, which is still going on and is very successful. It reaches places. Well, everybody knows now about the eye movement thing to treat anxiety. That's really something my father invented. It's just that he doesn't get credit for anything he invented. And that kind of therapy is still going on. Some do it right and some do it wrong, but that's, yeah. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Two comments. First, it sounds like your father was sort of a latter-day alchemist. Sometimes they got it right. And a second comment, transaction analysis seems to be almost a reinstatement or a restatement of some of Freud's thinking.
All right. I don't think I can answer any of these.
Sorry.
We could take maybe one more question. We've run out of time. Anyone have one? Okay. And then books. If you don't have one, step up and have Lore autograph one.
Thank you, Lore. I have read Lore's book. It's incredibly interesting and disturbing. And so thank you, Lore. And also, Lore, it sounds like your dad was ahead of his time and had some really good ideas that he wasn't able to, is the word market successfully to society or to the scientific community, and yet some of his discoveries and writings are still relevant today. What do you think of his legacy today?
Well, I think he really contributed a lot to a lot of topics. I mean, the mass psychology of fascism was just reprinted in German in the original form. What he did on character was later taken over by somebody called Heinz Hartmann, who was one of the ego psychologists, and put in other words that made more sense. I mean, even though now they think ego psychology was really stupid, I don't know, because I was trained in it, and that, but he took the character that Wilhelm Reich discovered and just changed the words and made it something more accessible. So really, my father was very successful. See, I think you have to distinguish between him going crazy towards the end and what he was in the beginning. He could be obnoxious, but he was very brilliant, and he became more obnoxious and probably less brilliant as in his later life.
Thank you.
Would you say that his ideas were seminal?
What?
I said, would you say that his ideas were seminal?
Yes.
Like seeds that others developed later on.
Right.
Lori, thank you. Thank you very much.